Today, we're diving into one of the most explosive and game-changing events in India's history, the Revolt of 1857. Now, this wasn't just some minor skirmish. This was a full-blown firestorm that would forever alter the relationship between India and the British Empire. So, let's get right into it.
And honestly, that's not an exaggeration. This quote nails it. You have to remember, for 100 years, British power in India just kept growing, looking almost unstoppable. Well, 1857 was the year the very ground beneath that empire started to crack.
But a storm like this, it doesn't just come out of a clear blue sky. The Revolt of 1857 was more like a massive explosion, and the fuse had been burning for a long time. 100 years, in fact, ever since the British East India Company really started its conquest at the Battle of Plassey back in 1757.
Okay, so first, let's talk about money, because this was at the heart of so much of the anger. British policies were just systematically taking apart India's economy. You had crushing taxes that drove peasants into debt, often forcing them right off the land their families had farmed for generations. Meanwhile, skilled Indian artisans couldn't compete with cheap British factory goods. The result? Widespread poverty and a deep, simmering resentment.
And politically, things were just as bad. The East India Company was like a hungry machine, constantly gobbling up Indian states. India's own rulers, the princes and nobles, were being pushed aside, losing their power, their land, their honor. And think about this idea of absentee sovereignty. It meant that the ultimate rulers were thousands of miles away in London, which led to a ton of corruption and mismanagement on the ground. So you've got economic pain and political humiliation. Now let's add a third layer, a real fear for their culture and religion. People saw Christian missionaries and British social reforms, even ones like banning Saudi, as an attack on their fundamental way of life. New laws that seemed to favor converts to Christianity and taxes on temples and mosques, it all fed into this growing paranoia that the British had a secret plan to destroy their faiths. So just imagine this massive pile of dry tinder, a century's worth of anger and fear, just waiting for a single spark. The whole thing was ready to go up in flames. It just needed one little thing to set it off. And, the ultimate irony? That spark came from the very people the British depended on to enforce their rule, their own Indian soldiers, who they called sepoys. It all came down to a new piece of military tech, the Enfield rifle. Now, to load this thing, a soldier had to bite open a paper cartridge, and a rumor, which turned out to be true, spread like wildfire. The grease used on these cartridges was made from pig fat, which is forbidden for Muslims, and beef fat, from cows, which are sacred to Hindus. For the sepoys, this wasn't just a rumor. This was proof. It was a direct, deliberate attack on their faith, confirming their absolute worst fears. And from there, things just escalated fast. In February, a whole regiment refuses to use the cartridges and gets disbanded. Then in April, one sepoy, Mangal Pandey, attacks his officers. He's executed and becomes an instant martyr for the cause. And then comes May 10th in the city of Meerut. It's the breaking point. The sepoys there openly rebel, they kill their British officers, and they make a critical decision. They start marching to the ancient capital, Delhi. That march to Delhi was the moment everything changed. The spark from the sepoy mutiny had just hit that tinderbox, and the whole thing exploded into a massive inferno that swept across northern India. And what they did when they got to Delhi was a stroke of genius. They found the old, practically powerless Mughal emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar and declared him the leader of their rebellion. In one move, this stopped being just a soldier's protest and became a revolutionary war. They had a symbol, a figurehead representing a return to Indian rule. And pretty soon, everybody was joining in. It wasn't just soldiers anymore. Peasants, artisans, shopkeepers, local landlords, basically anyone who had a reason to hate British rule picked up a weapon. They went straight for the symbols of colonial power, burning tax records, attacking courts, and tearing down telegraph lines. This was now a full-blown popular uprising. And something truly remarkable, something that's so important to understand, was the incredible unity between Hindus and Muslims. From the top leaders down to the ordinary foot soldiers, they were completely united. They didn't see each other as different. They saw themselves as Indians fighting a common foreign enemy. And leaders popped up all over the country. You had General Bakht Khan leading the military efforts in Delhi, Nana Sahib in Kanpur, the fierce Begum Hazrat Mahal in Lucknow, and of course, the legendary warrior queen Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi. This shows it wasn't just one rebellion, but a whole series of powerful, connected uprisings. Now, the British were definitely shaken, but they responded with absolute, overwhelming, and often brutal force. They brought in their best commanders, men like John Nicholson and Colin Campbell, and began the long, bloody process of taking back the rebels' strongholds, one by one. In the end, despite all the courage and popular support, the revolt was crushed by 1858. But even in failure, it triggered some of the most dramatic and long-lasting changes in the history of British rule in India. And here is the single biggest change. The revolt completely destroyed the East India Company. The British government decided a private company couldn't be trusted to run a subcontinent anymore. So in 1858, they dissolved it and took direct control. This was the official, formal beginning of the British Raj, with Queen Victoria herself as the Empress of India. But to this day, people still argue about what to even call this event. What was it really? A simple mutiny? A war of independence? Well, the answer depends on who you ask. For a long time, the traditional British view was summed up by guys like Sir John Seeley here. They basically dismissed it as just a sepoy mutiny. They painted it as a disorganized, selfish outburst by a few ungrateful soldiers with no real leaders or popular support. It was a way of downplaying just how serious it was. Then you've got a totally different perspective from Marxist historians. They see it as a much bigger fight, a struggle by the common people, the soldiers and peasants, not just against the foreign British, but also against their own oppressive feudal landlords. For them, it was almost like a class war. And then there's a more modern, balanced view from historians like Stanley Wolpert. And this quote really captures it. He says, it was way more than just a mutiny. It was too big, too popular for that. But it was also less than a first war of independence because it didn't really have a unified nationalist vision for what a free India would look like. So, at the end of the day, what's the big takeaway? The revolt of 1857 wasn't any single thing. It was a complex, violent explosion born from 100 years of economic pain, political humiliation, and deep cultural fears, all lit by that one fateful spark of the greased cartridges. And that leaves us with one last, big question. Yes, the revolt failed. The British clamped down even harder and would rule for another 90 years. But in the shared struggle, in the memory of its heroes and martyrs, and in the massive changes it forced, did the uprising of 1857 accidentally plant the seeds of a shared Indian identity that would one day finally win its freedom? That's something to think about.